It began in one of those congressional sessions that was supposed to be routine, a discussion over ethics, decorum, and the boundaries of political responsibility. Mike Johnson, seated with the confident posture of a man who had grown accustomed to commanding the room, decided to make an example out of Jasmine Crockett. His approach was familiar, polished, controlled, but heavy with condescension disguised as authority. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen to sound procedural, but the undertone was unmistakable. He wanted to corner her, to make her appear uninformed, impulsive, or out of her depth. Johnson leaned forward with a calm smirk, his tone dipped in politeness but sharpened with intent. Representative Crockett, he began, perhaps we'd have more meaningful dialogue if some of our members took the time to understand constitutional boundaries before making emotional arguments on live television. The remark drew a few awkward smiles from his allies on the panel. It was a subtle insult, the kind that suggested superiority without ever raising a voice. He expected her to flinch, to react offensively, to stumble over her words. Instead, she simply sat still. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to reply. Her silence was strategic, almost unnerving. She studied him for a moment, then adjusted the microphone with a measured calm. When she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, direct, and disarmingly steady. Mr. Speaker, she said, addressing him not as a colleague, but as the man behind the attempted humiliation. I assure you I understand the Constitution just fine. What I find harder to understand is why certain people only seem to cite it when it benefits their argument, or when they think they can use it to lecture someone who disagrees. Her words landed cleanly, not shouted but weighted. A faint rustle moved through the room, staffers shifting in their seats, reporters glancing up from their notes. Johnson blinked once, his smirk fading slightly. She didn't stop there. See, Mr. Johnson, she continued. The Constitution doesn't give you the right to disrespect someone under the pretense of procedure and emotional arguments. They're what real people make when they actually care about the issues that affect them. Maybe that's what makes you uncomfortable. The tone in the chamber changed almost instantly. Crockett had flipped the exchange from a lecture to a lesson, and she was the one doing the teaching. Johnson shifted in his seat, straightened his tie, and tried to redirect. Representative, I was merely making a point about, but she cut in gently, her voice unshaken. No, you were making a point about me, Mr. Johnson, and I just wanted to make sure we both understood the difference. The quiet in the room was deafening. It wasn't just that she had answered him, it was how she had done it. Crockett didn't need volume or dramatics. Her control of tone, timing, and truth dismantled his attempt, piece by piece. Johnson's usual tactic, subtle provocation followed by an assertion of authority, had failed. She hadn't played the game he set up. She'd rewritten the rules mid-conversation. After a few seconds. He nodded stiffly, pretending to move on, but his body language betrayed him. The small tilt of his head, the tightening around his mouth, signs that he realized he had underestimated her. The rest of the session moved forward, but the air never quite reset. Everyone in the room knew they'd just watched something more significant than a political disagreement. They had witnessed intellectual dominance over intimidation. Later. As the footage circulated online, the moment gained traction for that very reason. Viewers weren't cheering because Crockett had shouted him down. They were struck by how effortlessly she had maintained composure while dismantling his argument. Commentators described it as a match in political clarity and the kind of confidence that terrifies old-school politicians. Even those who disagreed with her politics had to admit that she had commanded the moment with intellect, not aggression. For Mike Johnson. It was an unexpected loss, not the kind that made headlines for chaos, but the kind that quietly erodes credibility. His attempt to humiliate her had become a lesson in restraint and intellect. Every phrase he had used to undermine her had been turned back on him with quiet precision. Crockett's poise didn't just win her the exchange. It exposed how hollow his superiority sounded when challenged by someone unafraid to match reason with reason. In the days that followed, political circles buzzed not about what was said, but how it was said. Her measured calm was what unsettled him the most. Crockett hadn't raised her voice once, yet she had managed to strip away his facade of control. It wasn't about outshouting him, it was about outthinking him, in real time, on live television, and that was something even his title couldn't protect him from. The exchange between Mike Johnson and Jasmine Crockett became more than just a viral clip. It became a symbol of a deeper shift happening inside the walls of Congress. For decades, the tone of political debate had been set by figures like Johnson, authoritative, steeped in procedural language that often served to silence dissent rather than engage it. He represented the old guard, composed, deliberate, but also dismissive of those who didn't fit his image of what a serious legislator looked or sounded like. When he attempted to put Crockett in her place with a few polished words, he wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking from a generation that believed authority was earned through tenure, not authenticity. But Crockett wasn't part of that world. and she made that clear without saying it outright. Her reply didn't just shut him down, it challenged the entire tone that politicians like him had long controlled. She didn't need to shout or perform outrage. Her steady confidence spoke to a different kind of power. In her poise and precision, she represented the emerging face of modern politics, one that valued clarity over condescension, substance over tradition, and equality over hierarchy. Johnson had underestimated what he was walking into. He assumed that his experience and title gave him the upper hand, that the weight of his position as Speaker could subtly guide the conversation his way. But the power dynamics that once defined congressional interactions were changing. Crockett's presence, sharp, unflinching, unapologetically herself, disrupted the script. She refused to play the deferential role expected of those who came after the established figures. When she looked him in the eye, encountered with logic and confidence, the balance of power in the room shifted right before everyone's eyes. It wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about what that moment revealed. That intelligence and conviction could dismantle hierarchy in a matter of seconds. Johnson's attempt to reassert dominance had backfired. He had walked into that hearing thinking his authority was unquestioned. By the end, it was clear that respect in this new political era had to be earned, not inherited through title or seniority. The generational contrast was stark. Mike Johnson represented the traditional model of political power, a man who believed that restraint and rhetoric could keep challenges at bay. Crockett represented something different, a lawmaker unafraid to expose the arrogance that hid behind formal politeness. She didn't try to be louder than him. She chose to be sharper, and that difference resonated far beyond the committee room. In the following days, analysts and journalists dissected the moment endlessly. Some called it a clash between decorum and disruption. Others called it a generational handoff, an acknowledgement that the old ways of wielding power were losing their grip. For younger voters watching, Crockett's composure wasn't just admirable. It was a reflection of their frustration with how politics had long operated. Johnson's attempt to talk down to her reminded them of what they wanted, changed. A system where authority often masked insecurity, and professionalism was too often used to suppress dissent. Behind closed doors, colleagues noticed the shift too. Johnson, who had built a career on measured dominance, found that the more he tried to reassert control through formality, the more out of touch it seemed. Crockett's ability to hold her ground without grandstanding made her seem not defiant, but modern, a politician fluent in both substance and authenticity. It wasn't rebellion for the sake of spectacle. It was conviction that didn't require permission to exist. That quiet transformation in tone was what made the moment so significant. The power that Johnson once wielded, the ability to silence someone through procedural confidence, no longer worked. Crockett's command of the conversation wasn't about challenging the rules. It was about refusing to let those rules be used as tools for dismissal. Her calm rebuttal exposed how outdated those tactics were. She had turned his strength's composure into her own weapon, using his style against him with even greater precision. As the headlines faded and the week moved on, something subtle but lasting remained in Washington's air. Younger lawmakers, staffers, and even the public had witnessed a moment that said more than any policy debate could. It showed that the traditional power structure, the one embodied by people like Mike Johnson, was no longer unshakable. Authority without respect, and rank without substance, could now be dismantled in real time. And though Johnson maintained his position and title, his exchange with Crockett lingered as a reminder that political dominance had entered a new era, one where intellect, presence, and authenticity mattered more than hierarchy. He had tried to humble her with his seniority, but instead, he had exposed how fragile that old kind of power had become. When the clip of Mike Johnson's exchange with Jasmine Crockett first hit the airwaves, it didn't take long for it to spread. Within an hour, snippets were being shared across platforms with captions like "Crockett shuts down Johnson, and this is how you handle condescension in Congress." What had started as a tense moment inside a hearing room turned into a nationwide conversation about tone, composure, and the power of presence. The encounter wasn't remarkable for shouting or chaos. It was remarkable for its precision. Viewers saw something rare, a calm dismantling of arrogance caught on camera, and it was Jasmine Crockett who delivered it with surgical control. Mike Johnson, known for his polished demeanor and calculated delivery, had underestimated the digital echo that followed every televised session. When he leaned back in his chair and told Crockett to better understand the Constitution, he was relying on an old formula, a public scolding wrapped in civility, meant to establish authority. In previous years, moments like that might have gone unnoticed beyond the walls of Congress, but this was a new era. Every exchange, every tone shift, every pause was recorded, replayed, and analyzed by millions. The public didn't just see a debate between two politicians. They saw an interaction that mirrored what many people experience daily. Being talked down to by someone who assumes their status protects them from pushback. Crockett's response hit home because it wasn't rehearsed or overly dramatic. It was real. She let the silence hang before speaking, and when she did, her words landed with intent. Viewers watched her keep her composure as Johnson tried to interrupt, and they saw something shift. the confidence leaving his face as he realized his usual tactics weren't working. Asterisk. Social media turned that moment into more than a clip. It became a symbol. Commenters flooded platforms praising how she kept her cool while dismantling his ego. Even those who weren't politically aligned with her admitted that her poise under pressure was commanding. "This is how you argue with someone who expects you to lose your temper," one viewer wrote. It wasn't the content of her words alone that struck people, it was how she held her space. Asterisk for Johnson. The fallout came subtly, but swiftly. His attempt to lecture her had turned into a case study of how not to handle confrontation in the public eye. Analysts replayed the footage frame by frame, noting how his confident smirk slowly disappeared as she spoke. He had been so certain that his usual measured tone would win him the moral high ground. But in a media landscape where authenticity outweighed polish, Crockett's unflinching steadiness was what resonated. He represented the old political rhythm, scripted, restrained, detached, while she embodied something the public now demanded. Unfiltered intelligence backed by conviction. Asterisk. Cable networks aired the clip on repeat, using it as an example of controlled power in politics. Talk shows debated whether Johnson's condescension reflected a broader issue within congressional culture. Some even called it a turning point, the kind of moment that forces leaders to rethink how they engage on camera. Johnson himself avoided commenting on the exchange afterward, but the silence spoke volumes. The man who once prided himself on being the unshakable voice of order had been shaken not by aggression, but by intellect. Asterisk. The digital aftermath only deepened the impact. Hashtags amplifying the clip carried messages about accountability and respect. Memes appeared comparing Johnson's stiff demeanor to Crockett's calm command. The irony was that he had tried to use that very platform, the hearing, to assert dominance. But it was through the very same broadcast that his misstep became public. The image of him trying to recover mid-hearing while Crockett held her composure became an enduring snapshot of a power reversal that no editing could fix. Asterisk. What fascinated most observers wasn't that she won the argument, it was that she didn't seem interested in winning at all. Her goal appeared to be truth, not victory. That made Johnson's attempt to provoke her look petty and outdated. In the replayed clips, her body language was everything. Steady hands, unwavering tone, direct eye contact. She made intelligence visible. Johnson, meanwhile, looked increasingly uncomfortable trying to match that energy. Asterisk. The moment revealed an evolving reality in politics. The court of public opinion no longer rewarded those who looked powerful but those who appeared sincere. Johnson had all the hallmarks of authority, title, tone, and tradition. Yet it was Crockett's quiet confidence that carried the day. The viral spread of their interaction wasn't accidental. It reflected a public hunger for leaders who speak plainly and stand firm without theatrics. Asterisk. By the time the weekend ended, even some of Johnson's usual supporters were privately admitting he had walked into that one. He had misread the moment, treating it as another opportunity to establish dominance rather than an exchange that demanded respect. In the digital age, that misstep was fatal to perception. The video continued to circulate, stripped of context, but it didn't need much. Everyone watching could see what had happened. Crockett had stopped him cold, not by raising her voice, but by letting truth and composure do the work. In the days following the confrontation, the deeper meaning behind Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Mike Johnson began to crystallize. What seemed at first like a sharp verbal back and forth revealed something larger, a moment of accountability that cut through the practiced civility of politics. Crockett's clapback wasn't born of ego or impulse. It was rooted in the same frustration many Americans felt watching leaders twist integrity into performance. Her response to Johnson wasn't about winning an argument. It was about exposing how easily some in power used decorum as a shield to avoid genuine scrutiny. Asterisk. Mike Johnson, for his part, had built a career on maintaining a calm and authoritative public image. His tone was often measured, his words chosen to project steadiness. But in that hearing, when he leaned on his position to suggest Crockett's approach lacked professionalism, he misjudged her entirely. He assumed that subtle dismissal would end the exchange, that she'd fall back into silence like so many had before. Instead, she met him with something his demeanor couldn't deflect: truth, delivered with precision. Asterisk. Her words had accountability woven into every syllable. She didn't insult him. She dismantled the assumption beneath his comment that intellect and decorum belonged only to those who conformed to his style. You don't get to define what professionalism looks like for everyone else, she told him, her tone steady. That single sentence struck at the heart of a broader issue: who decides what respect looks like, and who benefits when that definition is used as a weapon. Asterisk. The power in her response came from restraint. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice or grandstand. She simply told the truth in a way that couldn't be dismissed. Johnson's authority, so often unquestioned, faltered because his logic did. The cameras captured it all. His brief pause, the tightening of his jaw, the discomfort that flickered across his face as he realized her words carried more weight than his position could counter. Asterisk. That moment of reckoning resonated far beyond the committee room. It became a symbol of how accountability works in modern politics, not through shouting matches or procedural reprimands, but through clarity and exposure. When Crockett challenged him, she was doing what so many politicians avoid, calling out the double standards that allow power to operate without consequence. She wasn't afraid to look directly at him and name the behavior for what it was: dismissive and outdated. Observers noticed how Johnson's carefully managed image cracked under that pressure. His attempt to reassert control through calm repetition only highlighted his discomfort. Every time he tried to reframe the discussion, she calmly brought it back to the issue: integrity, transparency, and the misuse of civility to silence dissent. Her words echoed like a reminder: accountability isn't disrespect, and holding the powerful to their words is not a violation of decorum. Commentators quickly latched onto the moment as a case study in political courage. Crockett had refused to be diminished, and in doing so, she held up a mirror to the culture of deflection that defined Washington's power dynamics. Johnson became a symbol of that old culture, one that equated disagreement with disorder and confidence with arrogance. She had exposed a fragility behind it, showing that composure without honesty collapses under scrutiny. The hearings footage replayed on every major network, but what lingered wasn't the tension in their exchange, it was the calmness in her delivery. She didn't shout, didn't interrupt, didn't lose control. She simply refused to accept the unspoken rules that told her to stay quiet when being talked down to, and that refusal, captured live, made accountability visible. For once, it wasn't just the usual political theater, it was truth confronting power, without apology. Johnson's silence afterward said just as much as her words. He offered no clarification, no follow-up statement, no acknowledgement of what had transpired. For a man who prided himself on having the last word, his retreat spoke volumes. The story spread precisely because it was authentic, because people could sense that something had shifted. A politician had been held to account in real time, not through a headline or investigation, but through the quiet insistence of another refusing to let the moment slide. For many watching, Crockett's exchange with Johnson wasn't just about two lawmakers disagreeing, it was about what accountability looks like when stripped of theatrics. It was about standing firm without hostility, confronting power without fear, enforcing truth into spaces where it's often avoided. She didn't set out to humiliate him, she set out to remind him, and everyone watching, that accountability is not optional, even for those who believe they are beyond reproach. And in doing so, she redefined what strength looks like in politics. Measured and utterly unshakable in the face of power. When the moment between Mike Johnson and Jasmine Crockett passed, the room eventually settled back into its routine rhythm, but something about the atmosphere had changed. The exchange lingered, not because it was loud or scandalous, but because it felt like a turning point. It wasn't the kind of confrontation that gets forgotten once the cameras stop rolling. It was the kind that lives on precisely because it revealed more than either side intended. For Mike Johnson, the experience was a quiet but humbling one. He had entered that hearing certain of his composure, believing his calm authority was unshakable. But Crockett's response had exposed how fragile that composure could be when met with substance and conviction. His words had been polished, his tone practiced, yet the authenticity in her reply stripped away the layers of performance he relied on. He hadn't expected to be challenged with that level of poise. He certainly hadn't expected that challenge to resonate beyond the chamber walls. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about confrontation, it was about clarity. She didn't shout him down or seek to embarrass him. She simply spoke truth in a space where truth often gets buried under procedure and politeness. What made her response powerful was its restraint. She understood the moment, and she understood that the most effective way to stand up to condescension was not to meet it with equal aggression, but to let calm reason dismantle it piece by piece. That approach turned what could have been just another heated exchange into a statement of principle. Outside Washington, the public saw something they rarely see in politics: accountability delivered in real time. It wasn't orchestrated or premeditated. It wasn't for show. It was the kind of authenticity that's hard to fake. And it resonated because it reflected what so many people feel: the exhaustion of watching power go unchecked. Crockett's words, her tone, and even her silence afterward reminded people that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still, unwavering, in the face of arrogance. In the days that followed, the discussion wasn't just about who won the exchange. It was about what it revealed: that confidence without humility collapses under scrutiny, and that the era of unquestioned authority is fading fast. Johnson, for all his status and experience, became the embodiment of an older political rhythm, one that's giving way to something more transparent, more real, and far less forgiving of arrogance. That's what made the moment unforgettable. It wasn't drama for the sake of attention. It was a reminder that integrity still matters, that truth still cuts through pretense, and that power can still be held accountable, even in the smallest of moments. Mike Johnson learned that lesson in public, and Jasmine Crockett delivered it without raising her voice, just by standing firm, speaking clearly, and refusing to let anyone rewrite the meaning of her